Hey scholars, how are you? Hope you're doing well. All right, we're on chapter 17 now, the 15th of August. When we were reading last in chapter 16, the grave diggers, when they were digging the grave for Cut-Eye Higgins' future grave site, right? Because they decided that they would let him live in the town until they got a new teeth extractor or a dentist to come in. So Cut Eye has been saved temporarily, right? And so, but they still, because Praiseworthy spoke up about them not killing him in order to get the map, they still have to go and dig the site. So they went to go dig the site, Praiseworthy and Jack, and the last thing that I read was that they struck gold. All right, so I'm going to read chapter 17 and 18, the last two chapters all at once, and we'll have finished the book. And I have enjoyed this book, actually. At first, I wasn't sure if I was going to really get into it or into the characters, but I have, and I am especially interested in Praiseworthy. His character development and his traits of a person of integrity have really grown throughout the book, and I am excited to see what happens for these guys. All right, let's go. The 15th of August, Jack very nearly jumped a foot. By the GreatHornSpoon, he yelled, "Look, I see it. Pay dirt!" And Praiseworthy exclaimed, "Yeller as can be." The gold revealed itself like bits of sunlight trapped in the loosened earth. The two partners flung their hats in the air. In sheer exuberance, they clasped arms and swung around in a big oblong pit. "We've done it, Jack! We've done it!" Praiseworthy roared. "We've struck it rich!" In that moment, before Jack, in his excitement, realized that Praiseworthy had called him Jack, not Master Jack, just Jack, plain Jack, the way he had always wanted it to be. He thought he'd never stop leaping for joy. But then he fished out a gold lump and beat it with a stone, flat as a button. "Cut some steaks, quick, Jack!" Anything would do. Praiseworthy threw his tattered umbrella from their pack and pounded it into the ground. It made a fine corner post for their claim. Jack stripped a fallen pine limb with their clasp knife. Praiseworthy measured out 50 feet by strides, which would give them plenty of elbow room. Soon they had the boundaries staked, and Jack ran from corner to corner, hanging tin cans in place. They had their claim, legal as can be, and Praiseworthy laughed. Cut-Eye Higgins has done us a good turn in spite of himself. After the day's washings, Praiseworthy went to Colma to buy a long tom, and Jack stayed behind with the squirrel gun to keep an eye on things. Within 24 hours, miners had staked claims everywhere around them. The place quickly got the name of Grave Diggers' Hill. Praiseworthy and Jack worked from morning till night. They carried pay dirt bucket by bucket down to the slope to the sluice box in the river. The hole grew wider and longer. They filled a buckskin pouch and tied it off at the top. Hour after hour, Praiseworthy swung the pick, and day after day, Jack emptied bucket after bucket into Long Tom. Their fortune grew heavier. "Won't Aunt Arabella be surprised when we walk in?" Jack grinned one night after supper. Praiseworthy, smoking one of his long 9 cigars. "Why, we'll be able to use sacks of gold for doorstops." Praiseworthy gazed into the coffee fire, and his fingers touched Miss Arabella's small portrait buttoned in the pocket of his shirt. She was so far away, a continent away in Boston. He wondered what she was doing at that very moment. Staring into a fireplace and thinking of him, perhaps. But that was nonsense, he told himself quickly, and turned from the fire. He must not forget his place. Once back in Boston, he would take up his old duties again. He was, he reminded himself firmly, born and bred butler. Like his father before him and his father before him, Miss Arabella would be lost without him. Why, Boston would never accept him as anything but what he was, a butler. Still, Boston was a long way off, and there was the sound of the river below to enjoy and the cigar between his teeth to savor. One morning, a miner came rushing up the hill from Shirttail Camp. Doc Higgins has escaped. What's that? Said Praiseworthy, dropping his pick. Yep, during the night. He used them forceps of his on the jailhouse we built. Pulled the nails through like he was yanking teeth and got a board loose. Slipped right out. He's long gone by now, and good riddance. Praiseworthy wiped the sweat that had rolled down his whiskers. Maybe he learned a lesson, but I doubt it. He's just running from one noose to another. There are plenty of hanging trees in the diggings, and he'll be standing under one sooner or later with his feet off the ground. After almost 2 weeks of busting ground and shoveling dirt, their claim began to play itself out. The washings grew thinner and thinner. One by one, the other miners gave up on the Gravedigger's Hill. It had boomed, and now it was dying. The boomers pulled their stakes to follow rumors of some other gold strike. On the morning of the 15th of August, the day Praiseworthy was to face the Mountain Ox in a bare-fisted combat, the two partners struck their tent. Praiseworthy seemed in no hurry to keep up his appointment with in Hangtown. Jack wondered if Praiseworthy had changed his mind. Not on your life, Jack. We'll make it. Jack blindfolded Stubb, and they loaded up. They had 11 heavy pouches of gold dust, worth a fortune in San Francisco. Providing we get there, mused Praiseworthy, we might meet up with those road agents again. Exactly. This squirrel gun of ours barely scares off squirrels, Jack. I think the time has come for shooting irons. Jack's heart took a leap. A four-shooter? I think a four-shooter would be an excellent choice. They stood for a moment, gazing at their claim. The umbrella still rose from the corner with a tin can on top. Praiseworthy left it there. Gravedigger's Hill had been good to them, and they walked away as if they were abandoning an old friend. Almost at once, Chinese miners, with pigtails dangling from their flat straw hats, moved in to work over the diggings. Good luck, boys, Praiseworthy called. At Coloma, they traded in their pick and shovel, tent, and gold pans. They wouldn't be needing them anymore. They left Coloma on the stage, each with a revolver tucked in their belt. Jack rubbed his hand along the butt of the four-shooter. He felt invincible. He turned for the last look at Stubb. They had sold him to the justice of peace, and at that moment the official was sitting in the dust, his legs spread out before him, the burro looking very pleased with himself. I forgot to tell him Stubb thinks he's a mule, said Jack. Praiseworthy smiled. I'd say the justice of peace just found that out for himself. They reached Hangtown in the late afternoon. The main street was hung with bunting as if it were the 4th of July. The place swarmed with miners, horses, mules, and burros. It looked to Jack as if every man had an animal in the diggings had come to town. When Praiseworthy stepped out of the stagecoach, a shout went up. There he is! It's Bullwhip himself! Pitch Pine Billy rushed over with his ears bent under the weight of his hat. It's about time, he spit. The boys was grumbling that you run out on the match. Not that I blame you. Howdy, Jamocha Jack. Howdy, Pitchpine Billy. In another moment, Jimmy from town had crowded around and Buffalo John and Quartz Jackson. "You'll have to excuse the missus," said Quartz Jackson. "She don't want to watch." "Let's get on with it," said Pitchpine Billy. "Where's the mountain ox?" "Eating oysters over at the Chinese Chow Chow," someone answered. "He got hungry waiting around." "Somebody fetch him, boys! Spread out!" The miners formed a large circle in the center of the street. Others climbed on the roofs of the stores for a better view. When the mountain ox appeared at the doorway of the Chinese restaurant, Jack's heart dropped to his boots. The man from Grizzly Flats grinned. He had a neck like a stump of a tree. There was oyster juice in his beard. His chest looked as big as a flour barrel. "He is a large gent at that," said Praiseworthy, studying his opponent at a distance. He handed Jack his revolver, together with the buckskin pouches tucked under his belt and weighing down his pockets. "I'd wish we'd never come back here," Jack muttered. It's not a fair match, no, sir." "You want me to back out?" Jack took a breath and shook his head. "You gave your word. You have to stick by it." "That's right. And anyway, I intend to lick him." Praiseworthy stripped off his shirt. The mountain ox across the way did the same. He was as hairy as a grizzly bear and looked twice as broad. Jonas T. Fletcher, the undertaker, stood in the clearings. "You two gladiators ready?" Praiseworthy nodded. The mountain ox wiped the juice from his beard. He grinned and turned to a Chinese in the crowd. "Ali, go fry me up 24 more oysters. I'll be there in a minute as soon as I whip this bullwhip fella." "Come out fightin'," said the town undertaker. "If either one of you gets killed, I'll give him a free funeral job. May the best man survive." The undertaker scurried out of the clearing. Praiseworthy stepped forward, striking a pose with his arms. "Elbows in," he told himself. The mountain ox came with his arms spread like the wings of a buzzard. The crowd stood tense. Squirts of chewing tobacco raised silent puffs of dust. Jack's heart was pounding in his chest. The gladiators closed the distance between them, and the pride of Grizzly Flats wasted no time. He swung an arm with enough power to bust through a barn door. When it had run its course, the crowd was astonished to see Praiseworthy still standing. He had felt nothing more than the wind. He had ducked with the greatest of ease. The street brawler, with his wide-open stance, signaled his punches in advance. Immediately, Praiseworthy countered with a left jab. It didn't amount to much, but it surprised the mountain ox. Jack gazed towards the center of the clearing with a leap of hope. In the afternoon heat, Praiseworthy's back glistened with sweat. The new muscles along his arms and shoulders looked polished. Almost 2 months in the diggings, swinging a pick from morning to night, had its effect. He had the power to bust through a barn door himself. "Come on, ox, finish him off." "Don't be scared of him, bullwhip." Again, the mountain ox swung, and again Praiseworthy escaped with nothing more than a wind burn. He was getting the hang of it. He was vigilant. He was vigilant. He was concentrated. He knew that one misstep, one miscalculation, and the mountain ox would end the match with a single blow. 5 minutes passed. To Jack, it was like 5 hours, 5 days. The mountain ox swung one haymaker after another, but Praiseworthy dodged, ducked, or stepped aside. He cut a tall, lithe figure in the afternoon dust. Having by now made a thorough study of his opponent, as the book advised, Praiseworthy devised his attack. Left jab, he told himself. Keep them coming like bee stings. The mountain ox may be all muscle, but a nose is a nose. The crowd, in growing amazement, watched and chewed tobacco and squirted juice. Not only was Praiseworthy still on his feet, hadn't been touched. The oysters in the Chinese chow chow had burned to a crisp. Praiseworthy kept jabbing with his left, and the mountain ox's nose turned as round and red as a tomato. Once the gladiators had worked themselves to the very edge of the crowd, the mountain ox let fly a carefully aimed wallop. Just as carefully, Praiseworthy ducked, and the blow collided with Cheap John, the auctioneer. He went flying backwards, knocking down 6 miners like so many dominoes. The bout continued without let up, and the sun began to set through the pines. Praiseworthy had hardly exerted himself. He would duck, dispatch a left jab, and resume the stance he remembered so well from the gentleman's books of boxing. But the mountain ox had been swinging his arms like a windmill, and now his tongue was very nearly hanging out. His brawler arms, once so wide, he now seemed to drag at his sides. But, like a wounded animal, he was still dangerous. Still, it seemed to Praiseworthy the time had come to close the book. Big as was the pride of Grizzly Flats, he had a jaw like other men, and a jaw was a jaw. A final beasting, the mountain ox took his head and stuck out his jaw in a fury. Praiseworthy stepped in with a right cross from the shoulder, exactly as the book advised, and it felt to him as if he were hitting a barn door. Jack held his breath. The mountain ox was still on his 5 feet 5 seconds later, but he kneeled over backwards like a statue and lay spread eagled in the dust. A roar burst from the crowd, and Pitchpine Billy rushed in to hold up Praiseworthy's arm. The winner! I don't know how he done it, but you saw it. The fair name of Hangtown has been saved. Boys, let's celebrate. Praiseworthy pulled on his shirt, and Jack handed him his revolver. He stuck it in his belt. The miners were raising noise all around them, but the 2 partners regarded each other, exchanging a glance. Finally, Praiseworthy said, "How was that, Jack?" "I backed up my reputation fair and square, didn't I?" Jack's face glowed as if he had swallowed a lantern. He was bursting with pride. There wasn't a man in the diggings he'd rather have for a partner. Not Pitchpine Billy, Quartz, or Jackson, or not Pitchpine Billy, or Quartz Jackson, or Jimmy from town, or Buffalo John. It wasn't a fair match, no sir, Jack grinned. The mountain ox can hardly read or write. Why, he doesn't know B from a bull's foot. Okay, that was chapter 17. Let's keep rolling on through our last chapter, 18. The arrival at the Long Wharf. The following morning, Praiseworthy and Jack climbed aboard the stage for Sacramento City and were given a rousing send-off. Time was running out. Now they had struck it rich. They had better hurry back to Boston before Aunt Arabella sold the house with all its family memories. But lately, Praiseworthy found himself thinking less and less about Boston and more about Miss Arabella. Would she like California, he thought? And of course, she ought to be finding herself a husband. A man would be lucky to have her at his side. If only he weren't a butler. But that was unthinkable. He quickly forced the thought out of his head. Jack was almost disappointed when they came down out of the mountains and arrived at Sacramento City without even a glimpse of a road agent. He had been ready at any moment to draw his 4-shooter. A steamboat was waiting in the river. They bought tickets and went aboard with their heavy pouches of gold. Sacramento City drifted away from them, and in the 14 hours they would be in San Francisco. The captain, they learned, was trying to break his own speed record. 14 hours or less, he chuckled from the patio. Gentlemen, hold on to your hats. The small stern wheeler went charging down the river, blasting its whistle at anything that got in its way, even floating logs. Kanaka sailors kept pitching cordwood into the furnace. On the deck, the passengers amused themselves watching the needle rise on the steam gauge. 45-pound pressure and still rising, a miner from Poverty Hill chuckled. Why, we'll trim a full hour off the river record if we don't climb up on the sandbar first. Another passenger shook his head. It seems to me we could use a little less steam and a little more caution. Praiseworthy and Jack were weighted down with treasure. They carried their pouches of gold dust securely tied in their belts, with their revolvers bristling in the sun. Praiseworthy lit a long 9 cigar, and they sat behind the jack staff watching every bend in the river approach. Fine-looking country, Praiseworthy would say from time to time. Fine-looking country, Jack would agree. He sensed how much his partner hated to leave this rough, untamed territory. No one in Boston would think of referring to Praiseworthy as bullwhip, and Aunt Arabella would put a stop to Jack's coffee drinking. But Boston was where they belonged. They were not only miners abroad who were heading home. They were not the only miners abroad who were heading home. They met passengers who had abandoned their diggings in the dust, as poor as when they arrived. Some, standing for months in the chill streams, had picked up nothing but rheumatism. Still others, like Praiseworthy and Jack, had struck it rich, and their belts and pockets were heavy with gold pouches. The two partners slept in everything but their boots. When they awoke the next morning and went on the deck, the stern wheeler was entering the broad blue stretches of the San Francisco Bay. The masts of hundreds of ships could be seen in the distance, clustered around the port. We might get ourselves passage home today, said Jack. Might, said Praiseworthy. Every day counts. We've got to reach Boston before Miss Arabella does anything foolish. The passengers were gathering around the steam gauge, and someone called out, 58 pounds pressure, and still rising. At that moment, with the long wharf less than a half a mile, the broiler exploded with a roar, and the smokestack shot in the air like an arrow. The pilot house followed, with the captain still inside, shouting orders. The explosion lit the day and blew a hole in the bottom of the ship. Passengers were pitched over the side as if the gunshot from slingshots. Praiseworthy and Jack were among them. The next thing Jack knew, he was underwater, and the gold pouches, heavy as lead, were pulling him down. He fought to come up, but the weights kept dragging him below. Then, fighting for his life, he unbuckled his belt. Buckskin pouches and 4 shooters fell away into the deep. Seconds later, he bobbed to the surface. He spit water and looked around. The riverboat was gone. So was Praiseworthy. But a moment later, his partner appeared, breaking surface about 10 feet away. Jack felt a quick throb of relief. He wiped the wet hair out of his eyes. Hang on, partner, Praiseworthy, shoving over a splintered plank of wood. Are you all right? Ruination, Jack. I unbuckled my belt. Praiseworthy's whiskers were running with seawater. Think nothing of it, Jack. I had to do the same thing. Oh my gosh. Within 10 minutes, there were several other boats alongside, fishing passengers out of the bay. When Praiseworthy and Jack landed at the long wharf, they were not only as penniless as the day they arrived, but soaking wet to the boot. They had struck it rich, but their fortune was somewhere in the deeps of the bay. Gone forever, Jack muttered softly. But Praiseworthy was undaunted. Mere bits of colored metal, he grinned. We have our good health, damp as it may be at the moment. The captain gave us a very expensive bath, you might say. They wouldn't be returning to Boston with their pockets full of gold nuggets, but return they must. Aunt Arabella would need them even more now, with everything at home sure to be lost. They had hardly climbed up the boat stairs to the wharf when Jack noticed the Lady Wilma still riding at anchor. Strange, said Praiseworthy. Captain Swain had planned to sail home as soon as he could unload. Maybe he'll let us work our passage back, said Jack. A first-rate idea, remarked Praiseworthy. Without delaying even to dry out they borrowed a skiff and rowed to the Lady Wilma. Once alongside, they shipped their oars, and Praiseworthy raised his hands to his mouth. Hello! He called. There came no answer. There wasn't even a sound from the other ship that had anchored nearby. It was as if they had rowed into a graveyard of sailing vessels. Finally, they climbed aboard and looked around. The crew's gone, said Praiseworthy. There's not a soul on deck. It's spooky, said Jack. Praiseworthy shouted up to the pilot house, Captain Swain! There was no reply, except from a cat sunning himself on a rotting mound of canvas. Soon, another cat appeared from the hatch. When Jack looked up, he saw a cat walking along one of the yard arms. There is nothing here but cats, Jack said. Those cats from Peru, and they appear to have multiplied, Praiseworthy nodded. They were searching through the ship, and everywhere they looked were Peruvian cats and kittens. When they peered into the hold, they saw the cargo still there, waiting to be unloaded. Rats had gnawed into the barrels of smoked fish, and the cats had fattened themselves on rats and fish. What has happened here? Praiseworthy mused. It looks like Captain Swain has simply abandoned his ship. He scratched through his whiskers. Left it to all these cats. A yellow kitten was winding itself around Jack's leg, and he picked it up. This morning they had pockets full of gold nuggets. Now they couldn't pay for their fare home. He wondered how they would ever get back to Aunt Arabella and Constance and Sarah. Strange, said Praiseworthy again. They returned to the skiff, and Jack put the kitten in his shirt. They tied up the long wharf and walked into town and tried to find Captain Swain. Instead, they found Mr. Azariah Jones, the Yankee trader. He was standing outside an auction, bent inside a barrel of free pickles. Confound it, he said with a hearty laugh. I recognize the boy, but is that you behind the whiskers and the red miner's shirt? It's me, said Praiseworthy. Help yourself to the pickles. I've become an auctioneer. You have bad luck in the diggings? You might say so, said Praiseworthy. Help yourself to the pickles. You look hungry. Thank you, sir, said Jack. I am. What happened to Captain Swain? What happened to Captain Swain and the Lady Wilma? Asked Praiseworthy. The same thing that happens to almost every other ship that comes in here with gold fever. His crew ran off to the diggings. Why, there are more than 200 ships out there, rotten at anchor, deserted. Captain Swain couldn't even hire enough men to unload his cargo. Finally, he just gave up in disgust and got himself a passage home. Have a pickle. Is Dr. Buckbee still in San Francisco? Asked Praiseworthy. He tried a pickle. Not him. He got over the fever and gave up on the map of his. I heard he was horse doctoring somewhere upriver, doing fine too. Me, I'd be doing fine if the rats don't put me out of the cheap John business. Town's full of 'em. Why, a man can hardly stand still at night without something beginning to gnaw on his feet. Blame it. I just got hold of some flour from Chile, and the rats are stealing me blind. Rats, said Praiseworthy. Did you say rats? Remarked Jack. Mr. Azariah Jones nodded. I auctioned off a cat yesterday for $15. Cats, said Praiseworthy. Did you say cats? Remarked Jack, pulling the kitten from his shirt. Mr. Azariah Jones clutched the kitten as if it were a nugget of gold. Praiseworthy gave Jack a wink and looked Mr. Azariah Jones squarely in the eye. Why, I can safely say that Jack and I can supply you with an unlimited supply of ratting cats. Just provide us with a couple of bags, and we'll be back. The cat auction drew such a crowd that the street was almost blocked. Every storekeeper needed a ratter, and the bidding was spirited. Midway through the auction, the signal on the telegraph hill announced the arrival of a selling vessel, but hardly a soul left the auction. By late afternoon, Praiseworthy and Jack had a clink of gold pieces in their pockets. Their share of the cat money ran to almost $400. They wandered towards the long wharf to see the passage home. The sailing vessel had dropped anchor, and now passengers were coming ashore. Jack suddenly stopped. He saw a young girl in a dark traveling dress that reminded him of his sister Sarah. Beside her was a taller girl who reminded him of his sister Constance. Besides them was a woman in a straw hat and green eyes who looked exactly like Aunt Arabella. It was Aunt Arabella. Jack could barely believe his eyes, and then he realized that even Praiseworthy had stopped in his tracks. But the woman and the two girls passed them by, as if they were total strangers. "Sarah!" Jack cried out. The smallest girl turned. "Constance!" Jack exclaimed. The other girl turned. "Miss Arabella," said Praiseworthy. The woman turned, and then, suddenly, despite the disguise of jackboots, the rough red miner's shirts, and the slouch hats, she recognized her nephew and the butler who had left Boston so many months before. Jack dear," cried Aunt Arabella. There was a shout of joy, and they rushed back towards each other. Jack was engulfed in arms. Praiseworthy stood at the slight distance behind, and then, wiping an eye with her handkerchief, Aunt Arabella straightened and smiled and said, "Hello, Praiseworthy." "Hello, Miss Arabella. You're so changed, both of you." "Yes, miss." "I'm delighted to see you, Praiseworthy." "I'm astonished to see you, Miss Arabella and Miss Constance and Miss Sarah." Suddenly, they were all talking at once. "We sold the old house," said Constance, "soon as we could," said Sarah. "It was so big and full of musty old memories," Aunt Arabella said, smiling. "When we discovered Jack's note on the tea service, that the two of you were running away to California, the girls and I couldn't wait to follow you. It was time to rid ourselves of that house of the past. It's like being free of a curse. Let me look at you." "Did you find gold?" Sarah blurted out. "Plenty of it," said Jack proudly. "And I drink coffee now." "Coffee!" exclaimed Constance. "They call me Jamocha Jack in the diggings." "How dreadful!" Aunt Arabella laughed. She turned back to Praiseworthy, regarding him with a green-eyed twinkle. "And what do they call you?" "Bullwhip, miss." "How fearful! What has happened to your black hat and coat and umbrella?" "Gone. If clothes make up the man, as they say, Miss Arabella, I suppose I'm a miner now. Perhaps it's time I shed the past myself." "You look very You look a very striking miner, it seems to me. Aunt Arabella smiled. Out here, one man is as good as another. Only more so, said Jack. Aunt Arabella stood very straight. I've always believed it. Will you be returning to Boston? Asked Praiseworthy. Certainly not. That changed everything, and Praiseworthy crimped an eye, just like Pinch Pine Billy. Then he scratched through his whiskers. In that case, he stopped to gather up his courage. I mean, yes, said Aunt Arabella. If I'm no longer a butler, what I'm trying to say is, well, in California, we say a thing straight out. Aunt Arabella smiled. Then do stop beating around the bush, Praiseworthy. You see, yes, I mean, women are scarce out here, Miss Arabella. Before you can walk a block, you're going to have 10 proposals of marriage. How delightful. What I mean to say is, yes, he cleared his throat. Maybe this isn't the time or the place, Miss Arabella, but when a man strikes gold, he doesn't lose any time staking a claim. With sudden decision, Praiseworthy whipped off his hat. His mouth was as dry as a cured salmon, but he kept talking. If there's going to be any proposals of marriage, I intend to be the first in line. I've got no vices to speak of, although I've taken to smoking strong cigars. To say it outright, right, Miss Arabella, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Constance and Sarah began jumping up and down on their toes. Oh, do, Aunt Arabella! We know you gave him your picture a long time ago. He carries it in his shirt pocket, exclaimed Jack. Aunt Arabella was smiling through a wet sparkle in her eyes. Marry you? Why, of course, I thought you'd never ask. By the great horn spoon, Praiseworthy gasped. Jack had never seen him so flustered. He stared. Constance stared. Sarah stared. Suddenly, Praiseworthy gave the three of them a grin. Youngsters, if you don't stop staring, I'll take a brush to you. Jack was delighted to hear it. He went on gaping, and so did Constance, and so did Sarah. Aunt Arabella held her straw hat against the gust of wind. Then we'll be going back to the goldfields with you, won't we? Oh, it's no place for women and children, said Praiseworthy. We'll make it a place for women and children. We could build a cabin, said Jack, like Quartz Jackson. Perhaps we could do that, Praiseworthy said. On some hill within sound of a river, he thought. Why, he might even bring along a law book. He could read it at night. The Diggins could use some law, and a man had to think of making a future. Praiseworthy put Aunt Arabella's hand in the rook of his arm, and they started walking up the long wharf. They looked very much like a family. They felt like a family. They were a family. The end. Oh, my heart dropped into my belly when they lost the money in the river. I didn't think I was going to be able to recover there for a minute, but they have $400 now, and they're a family. Oh, I love that book, and that was a really good ending. Okay, guys, hope you enjoyed it. Bye.